biographical sketch today. It's been a long time since we've done these, but this is a moment for us to look at a hero of the faith. And we're going to keep our older kids in with us. They will enjoy this, I'm sure, because these are fun moments to review stories of men and women of the faith that stir us to live every day for God's glory. With the Olympics being in Paris this year, it is 100 years since a man named Eric Liddell, we would pronounce his name Liddell, but in Scotland they pronounce it Liddell. So Eric Liddell was an athlete who ran for Great Britain. He's a Scot by birth, but he was actually born in China. He was China's first gold medal athlete. And China today still counts him as their first Chinese-born gold medalist. So the first ethnic Chinese person who won a gold medal came years later. But this is a man who, if you've seen the movie Chariots of Fire, this was sort of built around his story, as well as Harold Abraham's, who he was running with. But let's look into the story of Eric Liddell. Eric was born January 6th, 1902. His mom and dad were missionaries in China, and they went to China during what was the Boxer Rebellion. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. The Boxer Rebellion started in 1899, lasted for a few years. These were peasants and workers who rose up against foreign people in anger. During the 1800s, the rest of the world got an idea that they could go into China and just take over things. And the British said, hey, here's some opium. Have that, and then we're going to take over your land. And they did, to a large extent. And there were times and seasons where the Chinese people said, we're tired of this, and we don't want these foreign devils coming in, taking over, and telling us what to do. So they actually came. There was another time where another foreign empire, not the British, came in and tried to introduce heroin, and they finally said, enough, stop drugging us, we want to rule ourselves. But back then, the arrogance of some people in the world thought that others couldn't rule themselves and they needed outside influence. But the Boxer Rebellion was a bloody affair. Another missionary named Jonathan Goforth was a missionary during this time in China, and he was beat up by the Chinese during the Boxer Rebellion. And this was an attempt to get rid of all the foreigners. And this is the location, this is the time period that James Liddell, Eric's dad, said, I want to go there. I want to go there because those people need Jesus. He was actually there a little before the Boxer Rebellion, survived the Boxer Rebellion. His town that he was ministering to put up a sign because they had to go back into the city before coming back to where they were when the fighting kind of died down because all the farmers were in an uproar. He came back and they put a sign. His town put a sign up and said, all foreigners welcome. And that was for James and his family to know, you can come back here. We want you to be part of our lives. So this is where, in this moment, Eric Liddell is born in 1902 to his parents during this time. And he lived at a large compound that the London Missionary Society had in Shaochang in the Great Plain of North China. So there's a map right there. You can see kind of where he was located in that area, and they actually call it a county, which is, I don't know, it's like, wow, that's a very English thing. Spent his first 5 years at this missionary house, and he spoke perfect Chinese at 5 years old. His family needing a stay back home got granted a furlough, which was a year-long back in their homeland. And Eric's older brother, Robert, 2 years older, said, we're going home. And Eric said, what do you mean? We are home. No, he said, we're going to Scotland. Scotland? What's that? All Eric knew was China. But they boarded a boat in Shanghai, a German steamer, and a 6-week voyage. After 6 weeks from Shanghai, they finally got to England and then to Scotland. Adele, if you'd put up the next one that gives a picture of where Scotland is, the island of Great Britain, with England there. They spent the furlough, the year, visiting family, talking to people. It sped by, and at the end of it, Eric's mother had something very important to tell her sons. The two boys would not be returning to China with the family. It was time for them to start their formal education in a proper English school. So in 1908, it was normal for children of missionaries to attend boarding schools in England while their parents served overseas in foreign countries. Eric was 6 years old. His brother was 8 years old. It would be 7 years before he saw his parents again, well, his mom. He had a younger sister, younger brother. He had a younger brother that was born in China. He didn't meet till he was around 3 years old. But it was 7 years before he would see his mother again. It was actually 13 years before he would see his father again. Can you imagine that? Thankfully, he had his brother. And his brother Robert took care of him. His brother Robert was the extrovert. Eric was very, very shy. He didn't want to talk to anyone. But they attended Eltham College, which is still in existence today in southeast London. And out at Eltham, their activities, it wasn't all about learning. They didn't use sports as a hobby just to give somebody something to do. It was part of their school day. So part of the school day, like we have PE classes. If you're in school, you go to PE class. You got to be exercise and stuff. It was serious, and they would play rugby. They would play cricket. They would play tennis. They would play all of the English football, soccer. They would play all of the English sports, and Robert and Eric excelled at all of them. They were the best athletes in the class. To where, when it was time for Robert, when he was graduating, the only competition that Robert had was Eric. They were the ones that went after each other all the time. They had to be on opposite teams because if they were on the same team, they'd win too much. At 10 years old, Eric wrote to his mother and said, "I don't think much of lessons, but I can run." He loved to run. After a play that he was in, everybody was forced to be in a play. And he was so shy, he didn't want to be in the play at all. So there was a role of a mouse that stood on the side, and that's what Eric got to play. And so he had the nickname The Mouse. That lasted with him all through his experience at Eltham till he went to college. During 1918, all these years leading up to their graduation, they were actually sending all of the boys who were graduating from the school were going into what was then the Great War, but it ended up being World War I. And at chapel every week, they would hear the names of the old boys who had died during their time during the war. And so he grew up thinking, man, there's all this turmoil. What's going to happen? Well, things settled down by the time he and his brother graduated. His brother went on to medical school, became a doctor. But they both were athletic stars of the school. Eric was a star at rugby. He was a star at cricket because he ran really fast. He was on the wing in rugby, and in rugby you have to throw the ball backwards, and as soon as they got it to him, he'd run down the sideline and nobody was able to catch him. So he enjoyed that. His senior year, thankfully, he passed his exams, but he set a new school record for the 100-yard sprint, the 100-yard dash. It was a school record that took a long time to be broken. And as he is being seen as this rising sports star, somebody in the school said, "Hey, how about we work together and you start running track?" He said, "All right." So actually Eric went out there for the first time, the first race he's going to run, and he sees all these other runners doing these weird hops to get loose. And he went, "I'm not going to run because I don't want to do that." Well, the guy named Bill Harvey, who was training him, said, "Look, you have to do some of it because your muscles have to be loose in order to do it, and it may help you go faster." And so reluctantly, Eric said, "All right, but I don't want to do some of those things." He said, "All right, we'll just do some of them. You don't have to do all of them." So Eric, when he ran his first competition, was so fast that everybody took notice. But he was told many times that he had a very odd running style. he would fling his head back and run to where people didn't even know if he could see, and he would thrust his fists in the air like this, looking like he was punching at something. But yet, he was so fast that everybody took notice. What they also took notice of was that his attitude was always like Jesus. During that time, and although he wanted to win every race that he was a part of, and he trained very hard to do so, he always had a good attitude toward his competitors. So before the race, he would shake hands with each of his competitors. And also, if you look at that picture, they would, right now you have the blocks that the runners start with, and they're able to push off to get a good start. Back then, they would dig a little hole and put their toes in it. And he had a trowel that would dig holes and put it back in his pouch. Well, he would offer that trowel to other runners who didn't have one. And then he would beat them. He would win all the races. One time, a competitor complained about being in the far outside lanes, the worst lane. Lane 8 is the worst lane. Back then, I think it may have just been 6 lanes. It was the worst lane because you can't see anything. You don't know where you are in reference to the other runners. You don't know how far ahead you are. So this guy was complaining, and Eric went over to him and said, hey, we can swap. Eric had the preferred lane. So he swaps lanes with the other runner, and it made no difference because he still won the race. He excelled also at rugby, so much so that the selectors of the Scottish national team invited him to come play for them. So he was on the national, it was a big deal in Scotland, so everybody began to know, the whole country began to know who he was. But as he was doing this, Robert, his older brother, was serious about his faith, loved Jesus, and he wanted everybody to know he loved Jesus. And he wasn't afraid to talk about Jesus. He wasn't afraid to talk about anybody about Jesus. Eric, being very shy, people didn't know where he was in his faith because he wouldn't verbalize it. He wouldn't say out loud anything about Jesus. He always kept it to himself. He went to church every Sunday. He read his Bible. He lived a Christ-like life, but for some reason, he didn't feel comfortable talking to others about God. So Robert's friend had an idea. They would go around, and Robert was participating in this, and every now and then Eric would show up, but they would do these nightly gatherings in different towns, and they would invite people who normally didn't go to church to come to church and hear about Jesus and his death on the cross for them. And so they would go, and they would have some people come, but Robert's friend said, I've got an idea. What if we ask Eric to come? And then everybody who knows that Eric is going to be there, then more people will come, and then we'll be able to share the gospel with them. And Robert said, you can ask him. So Eric came in a short while after, and Robert's friend got up the courage and the nerve, and he says, okay, there's an idea. I want to see what you think about it. You come, everybody knows who you are, but then as everybody's there, you get to then share about Jesus with them. His friend said, after what seemed like an eternity, Eric finally looked up and said, all right, I'll do it. Tell me where you need me and when. And from that point onward, everybody knew where Eric stood in his faith because that changed the course of his life forever. His private life was now a very public life. And that happens with us. When we love Jesus, at some point, we're going to have opportunity to say how much we love him. And huge crowds turned out to see this famous rugby player who could run really, really fast. But he always spoke quietly, as if chatting with a good friend. He spoke about God. He spoke about how God was in control of his life and how he accepted whatever happened to him as God's best for him at that time. As he went from town to town, Eric began to recognize there's a lot of people who knew him. Fame found Eric. He wasn't out searching for the fame. It found him. But he recognized that God brought this gift of fame. He called it that. It was a gift of fame. And he thought it was very important that he would steward this gift that God gave him. And now he was always ready to talk to anybody. He still was quiet, mild-mannered, but he talked to everybody. When he was asked in one of the towns why he ran so fast, he often told people that he ran as fast as he could for the first half of the race, and then he prayed and asked God for the strength for the second half. He just always ran. Well, the British they began to recognize all the races that he was winning, and they invited him to be on the Olympic team to represent Great Britain in the 1924 Paris Olympics. Even in one of these races, he fell down. A runner came and bumped him. He falls down. He tripped, fell, thought he was disqualified because he went outside the lane, but since he didn't touch any other runners, he wasn't disqualified. He recognized it. He got back up, and it was a whole lap around the track. He was behind and then ended up winning the race because he was so fast. He caught him, chased him, caught him, and then won the race. He qualified for two different events in the 1924 Olympics, the 4x400 and then the 100-meter relay. That's the big one. That's like still today, it's the fastest man alive, fastest woman alive race, and everybody's wanting to know about the 100-meter and who's gonna be the fastest and who's gonna be able to have that title for the next 4 years. Well, something happened when he got the schedule for when those events were going to happen. He hasn't gone to Paris yet. He's still in Great Britain. But he gets the schedule and he sees that what they do is they run races. They have a lot of people, and they have different races, and all those people run. And the best three, the top three winners of those races get to go in the final race in order to win gold, silver, or bronze, first, second, or third. Well, he sees that it's called heat. Those are heats. He sees that those heats for both of those races are going to be held on a Sunday. Eric, from when he was very small, he always held Sunday as a day of rest where he was just going to honor the Lord and do whatever the Lord wanted and not do work. He honored that as a holy day that God had for their family. Their family always considered Sundays as that day of rest. So he said this, I'm not going to run in those heats, which meant he had to withdraw himself. He was withdrawn from those races, and then it dashed all the hopes of Great Britain having someone of their own to be the fastest man in the world. He would not compromise. Rather than forfeit Eric's position on the Olympic team, he was ready to say, I'm not going to go to the Olympics. But the British committee asked him, hey, will you sign up for another couple events that don't have their heats on Sunday? And these are events that he never trained for, he wasn't familiar with, but he said, okay, I'll do that. And while he trained and waited for the Olympics, and this is like maybe just 2 weeks in between when he's saying, okay, I'll do those, and then they're trying to, and training back then wasn't anything like it is today. His brother Robert had graduated during this time when he's waiting for the Olympics to start. His brother graduated from medical school and went back to China. Robert went back to serve as a missionary in China as a doctor. And he got a letter from Eric. He sent a letter to Eric, and Eric read it. And Robert talked about the need of the people to hear the gospel. And Eric, in that moment, made a decision in his heart before the Lord. And he said, I'm going to follow in my family's footsteps, and I'm going to become a missionary to China when this is all done. Well, the Scots and British people did not treat Eric well when they heard he would not run on Sundays. They thought it was selfish of him to deny Britain a gold medal. Eric Liddell had thrown away a golden opportunity for a gold medal, but they would not overlook it, and many would not even forgive him. There was a man Lord Cadogan, who was addressing the Olympic team. And as he's addressing the Olympic team, he said, to play the game is the only thing in life that matters. And he looked right at Eric when he said it. And Eric got the point. But Eric knew the game's not the only thing that matters. There's a higher purpose. There's a greater purpose for us all. Well, the other gentleman, Harold Abrahams, who qualified for the 100-meter race, Eric and Harold were running neck and neck most of the time, and Eric always beat him. But Harold Abrahams eventually won the 100-meter race that Eric would have run in, and that's the picture of him winning that race. Now, here comes the 200-meter. which is half a lap. Eric had agreed to run it, but he didn't know exactly how to train for it. He ended up coming in third, a bronze medal for Great Britain. Harold Abrahams also ran in that race and came in last. So he's still running fast. But now it was time for the 400-meter race, one lap around the track. The final was set for an evening, Friday, July 11th, 1924. And everybody wanted to see what was happening because in all the heats, all the races that led up to the final race, there was a new world record that was set every single time that race was run. So all the people who set the record were going to be in the final. Eric ran, was able to qualify, but here's what he did. He knew whatever happened in the final of the 400 meters, he knew he had honored God first, and that was worth all. It was worth way more than an Olympic medal, no matter what it was. Well, he drew the outside lane, the worst lane, because you can't see anybody that's coming. And against all odds, he won. And he won with a new world record of 47.6 seconds. They run it faster these days, and it's amazing how fast people run it these days. But he won. He won from the outside. When he finished the Olympics, they'll do the next couple pictures. You'll see the finish of that race. When he finished the Olympics, he returned to London to find that he was a national hero. Everybody all of a sudden forgave him because he got a gold medal. He traveled to Edinburgh, Scotland to graduate from college where he was attending. And after the graduation, they presented Eric with a wreath. This is how back in the old times, 2,000 years ago when they did the Olympics, they would give all the winners wreaths to wear on their head. Well, the headmaster of the school presented Eric with a wreath, and then they carried him down the street on a chair connected to poles. He was a national hero. And for the next week, receptions, parties were held for Eric every day. At the last party, ended up being the last party because he said this. At each party, he would give a short speech, thank everybody for their encouragement. And at the last party, he announced, "Since I have been a young lad, I've had my eyes on a different prize. You see, each one of us is in a greater race than any I have run in Paris, and this race ends when God gives out the medals. It has always been my intention to be a missionary, and I have just received word that I have been accepted as a chemistry teacher at the Anglo-Chinese College in Tianjin, China. From now on, I will be putting my energy into preparing to take up that position." Can you imagine that? When you are at the top of your game, fame is awesome and it's great and everybody knows you. And he said, I'm going to follow Jesus and go do what he's calling me to do. It reminds me of Philippians 3:14. Mr. Denny, can I ask you to go ask that guy outside to not be blowing leaves? Because I can deal with a lot of noise, you know that. That one is a bit irritating. We do something for an hour and 15 minutes once a week. Help us out, buddy. All right. It reminds me of Philippians 3:14. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Eric was living for the prize that mattered. Not the prize that perishes that we get. Remember, you're young and you accumulate all of these medals and trophies, and then what happens? You get older, they end up in a box, maybe in the attic or in a storage room. Because they don't last. But there is a reward that comes to those who follow Jesus and honor him with everything that they are. And the Bible tells us that reward never tarnishes. It never rots, and nothing can make it eat away or disintegrate, because God gives the awards and the rewards that last forever. From now on, Eric would no longer be living in a country where he was a national hero and recognized at every corner. He was about to become a stranger in a strange and troubled land. He went back to Tianjin, which today is present-day Tianjin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly at all, but I just say it confidently, and maybe you think that is. He returns to China in 1925. These were very hard times in China because you had different people groups that were vying for position. You had the nationalists the Chinese who wanted to govern themselves, but you also had a new and up-and-coming group of people called the communists who looked at what the Bolsheviks did in Russia and said, oh, we want to do that. Farming, everybody who did the farming said, oh, it shouldn't be that everybody in the city has the most money. We should distribute it, and everybody should be equal. We had the communists, but they also had the Japanese who found an opportunity to come in and occupy parts of northern China for the resources. Japan being an island, a collection of islands, they don't have a lot of place to plant and grow crops, so they wanted to go into other countries and occupy those countries so they could have some resources for themselves. Well, they're all vying for the same land. And what would happen is they would come into a village, they would ransack the village, they would steal all the food, and they would stay there a few weeks. And then if it was the nationalists would move on to another city because they ate another town because they ate all the food. But then the communists would come a few weeks later and they would do the same thing. And then the communists would get bored and they'd go off to another village and ransack that village for food. And then the Japanese would come in. And so it was this continuous cycle of people coming in. And the Chinese were battered by that. They saw the foreign devils as symbols of China's humiliation. And it was to this China that Eric Liddell, now 23 years old, would be returning. He came into the welcoming arms of his family. He met them at the beach on China's coast, and his father let him know that in all the turmoil, China had organized strikes, so they didn't know if any students would be showing up at the school that he signed up to work at. At the Anglo-Chinese college, all that Eric could do was wait. All right, I'm just going to wait. I'm going to show up. All 500 students had gone on strike is what they heard, but now the founder of the school said, we're just going to go. And the founder of the school set this up to reach rich Chinese people. You know, everybody was China Inland Mission that Hudson Taylor had started, was going out into the countryside, and they were reaching everybody for Jesus. And the founder of this school said, wait a minute, there's people in the city that still need to be reached. And so he set up a really nice school. And he wanted to reach the people who had the money. He wanted to reach the rich people too. Well, Eric showed up on the first day of school waiting. He and the other teachers, 150 students ended up showing up. And after a few weeks, all of the strikes died down, and then more and more people started coming. So they had a full school year. And Eric was in charge of a group of students, around 25 to 30 students. And he would meet with them and have a Bible study. He would help them get through struggles that they were having. And he met with them to tell them that living the Christian life meant that you don't cover up your weaknesses and your mistakes, but instead you strive to live sincere lives. He told them the origin of the word sincere, which is Latin, two Latin words meaning without wax. And the students looked at him and said, that's kind of strange. And he described that years ago when artists would make sculptors would be sculpting something out of marble or stone, every now and then there'd be a chip, and they were, rather than get a new huge stone to come and redo that, they would put wax on it and paint it. But when the marble was perfect and no blemishes and no wax was added, at the bottom the artist or the sculptor would say, sincere, without wax. Sign the name. And that's where we end our letters saying sincerely. We're saying it genuinely, but we're saying without wax. Well, the students ended up, they took the without wax part, and they would sign, well, every time they would write a letter to Eric, their teacher, they would sign it without wax and put their name. But he was living and modeling this sincere life in front of the students. His Bible study group was going very well, and he was the athletic trainer at the school. He was the coach. But the Chinese boys would wear these big, long robes, and they didn't want to run around in their robes because it was hot, and they wouldn't wear. One time, Eric came out in his T-shirt and shorts, and they started laughing at him because he looked crazy. But they didn't want to wear that, and so then he finally talked them into just wear a big shirt. How about you just do that? But they didn't. The teaching of the games wasn't going very well because they would quit really easily. If they felt like something went against them, the whole team, that's it, I'm done, and they'd walk off. Or if they get hurt, they're like, I got hurt, I'm not playing anymore. Well, they're playing on this ground. Eric's trying to teach them rugby, and they're falling down, their knees are getting scraped up, and they say, we don't want to play this anymore. Well, Eric said, I have an idea, let's get a good playing surface, and he got permission to build a stadium. And that stadium is still there today. In 1927, and he got the permission in 1925 or 26. In 1927, there was the annual International Athletic Games was held in the stadium for the first time. It was the first event in the new stadium, and Eric ran in that race. But a photographer thought it would be a good idea to go out onto the track and take a picture of Eric coming straight at him. But the photographer didn't realize how fast Eric was coming at him, and Eric, having his head back, didn't quite see him, runs into the photographer, the camera and the film goes everywhere, and he lost the race. It was the first race he lost, or didn't place in, since his school days. He'd always beat everybody. But the photographer he apologized. But Eric got over it. He then ran in 1928. He was not asked to go back to the Olympics for Great Britain, but he ran in the South Manchurian Games in China. And the Olympics at that point for that year were in Amsterdam, Holland. But he ran in 2 races during the South Manchurian Games, and his times in those races were faster than the winners of the Olympics. He was still running and running and running. And for the second race of those games, he had this small window to be able to get to the boat to take him back to Tianjin. And he only had 30 minutes from the end of the race to get into a taxi and then go over to the dock. And he got a taxi early, and he had him wait outside the stadium so he would run the race and then he'd walk off. Well, he ran the race, he won the race, and all of a sudden the band started playing Great Britain's national anthem, God Save the King. So he had to stand there and wait. And waiting and waiting. Finally, it ended. He went to go, and the band started playing the French national anthem, which was for the second place runner. And so he had to stand there again and wait. He finally runs out into the taxi. The taxi brings him to the dock, only for him to find out the boat is pulling away. He missed it. Well, at that moment, a wave came out of nowhere and pushed the boat back toward the dock. And Eric sees his opportunity. He throws his bags. He runs back, gets a start, and jumps 15 feet and makes it on the boat. A reporter was there, and the headline the next day read, "Flying Scotsman leaps 15 feet." So he had a new nickname. He was now the Flying Scotsman. Well, just like any single man is wondering what God would do in bringing a wife. Well, when he met his family out on the beach when he first got there in 1925, he actually met a woman named Florence, who was called Flo, Florence Mackenzie from Canada. She was a daughter of missionaries, and she was there at the beach, and he recognized her, took a liking to her, but he was 27 and she was 17. She was still in her senior year in high school, and he thought, this is going to be a little weird if I start dating her. So what he would do is he would invite the entire class to go get ice cream so he could hang out with Flo. He would do different things. He would invite the entire class to go do things so it wouldn't come off weird. But everybody knew his interest really was Flo. Flo's desire was to go back to Canada for school and become a nurse. And so he said, I know what I can do. You go be a nurse, and then when you come back, you'll be old enough for me to marry you. But he couldn't wait until she went to school, so he asked her, will you marry me? She was startled and stunned, because here is this famous guy. Why would he be interested in her? But he said, no, I want you to be my wife. And she says, yes. But he says, but we're not going to get married yet. You go back to Canada. You get your education. You become a nurse. Then come back, and then we'll get married. And that's what they did. During that time, he returned to England when she was in Canada. He returned to England. He got to go back and forth and visit her and her family. When he got back to England in 1932, instead of being forgotten, he was actually more popular than ever. At one church, he was asked to write their signature book. That was typically in the back of churches, a little directory of who had come through there. And he wrote his name, but then he wrote the Chinese characters that translate into "keep smiling." And the pastor said, because the pastor said, "What did you write there?" He said, "It's keep smiling." And he said, "That's interesting. We have a lady in our church who writes her name and then says, 'keep smiling.'" And Eric asked about the girl. Her name is Bella. It was Bella Montgomery, and she said she was in a bad accident a few years ago, and she ended up losing she was scalped, and she ended up losing an eye from this accident. They were able to do skin grafts to put her head back together, but she was nearly blind and pretty deaf. She couldn't hear. So Eric says, "Can I meet her?" Pastor said, "Sure." So they organized the time to be able to meet. And here, Bella thought, "This is great. I'm meeting an Olympic champion. This is really fun." But they were able to hear one another's story. And Bella wrote a letter to Eric and gave it to him when he was leaving that town. And when he was on the train, he read the letter. And the letter simply stated that all through her struggles, she learned to look at Jesus. And she learned that whenever she's looking at Jesus, she can keep smiling, no matter what the situation is. That made Eric smile because he recognized, we have to trust God that way. And there was a man in that moment across from him he was distressed. He was looking down and he didn't know what to do. And so Eric started talking to this man and said, "Are you okay?" He says, "No, I'm not okay." His family was in shambles. He didn't know what to do. He was contemplating ending his life. He just didn't know what to do. And Eric just gave him the note from Bella and said, "Look, I just want you, it's only a page long. Read this." The man read it, and by the time they got off the train, he was better. Bella had even touched his life. While he was in London, he visited his old school, and he was pressured. They said, "Come on, let's run a race. And with the boys in the school. And he said, "Okay, I'll do it." And he beat all the boys in the school, even as a middle-aged man. Well, he goes, while he's going from church to church, everybody's asking him, "Hey, how's it going in China?" And he was getting letters from his brother that things were actually getting worse. And the Japanese had become very bold in how they were occupying the land. They had bombed Shanghai, which is the busiest port in China. And through all the questions, and when he was answering these questions, something in Eric was saying, "I've got to get back to China," because there was a lot of missionary work still to be done. He travels back to China, and then Flo finishes. She comes to meet him. They get married in March of 1934. During that time, he hears that his dad, James, he wanted to go back to be a missionary, but the London Missionary Society, "James, you're just too old, you're frail, you can't go back." So he ended up staying in Scotland. But then Eric got notice that he had died suddenly after his return. So March 27th, 1934, Florence Mackenzie, Eric Little were married at Union Church in Tianjin. Shortly thereafter, Patricia, their first daughter, was born. A year later, Heather was born. Eric loved the name Heather, and he wanted his next child to be named that. And so Flo didn't want the name to be Heather, so he said, "Okay, I'm going to write names on a piece of paper, and I want you to choose." And so he writes the paper. She chooses. It's Heather. Well, he starts laughing and laughing and laughing. He wrote Heather on both pieces of paper. He said, "I want her to be." So she said, "Okay." And she always told the story about how Heather got her name. Now, they're in Tianjin, but there's turmoil in the countryside. Eric was actually asked to go back to the area that he grew up in. This is a big decision because it was mean. Because there was so much turmoil and it was dangerous, his family couldn't go with him, and he'd be 400 miles away from his family in the city, and he was going out there, and he had to pray about it. And after much prayer and discussion with Flo, he said he would go back. Robert was out there, so he met up with Robert, who was a doctor out there. But soon after he met up with Robert, he realized, "You need a rest." And so Robert was married, had children. He was able to get a furlough and go back to Great Britain for some rest. Many of the people in Shaochang, they remembered Eric. They remembered him as a little boy. They remembered his family. And they remembered his dad who pastored in that village. And they called him Li Mushi, which Li, short for little, and then Mushi was pastor in Chinese. And what they had called his father, they now called Eric. So he's gone from being the mouse, the flying Scotsman, to now Li Mushi, their pastor. Eric's job was to visit villages across the plain. He would travel by bike, but that was difficult because one day he could pass on a road. The next day, a bomb had gone off in the road, and he couldn't pass by. He began helping in the hospital. And within the hospital, he would always ask, why are we only treating the Chinese who are injured? We have Japanese, the communists, they're all hurt. They said, because they're the enemy. Well, his good attitude prevailed so much so that they started treating everybody at the hospital. It's at the London Missionary Society Hospital, everybody found love. Eric was sent back to Tianjin for more coal to heat the hospital because it was running down. So he had the idea, the London Missionary Society within Tianjin said, look, rather than take all the money with you, just go ahead and buy a barge of coal and go up the river. Well, he bought a barge of coal, but as he's going in the middle of the night, he fell asleep, and bandits came and stole most of the coal. And the next morning, they were bolder, and they just came and took the rest of the coal. So he said, we can't do this. So we went back, he got more money, and he hid it. He said, how am I going to do this? He brought some groceries, and in the bag of groceries, he had a loaf of French bread. And he hollowed out the bread and put all the money in the bread. And he walked with the money in plain sight, but it was in the bread. And he was able to make it all the way back to Tianjin to buy coal there. But while he was all the way back to Shaochang. But while he was in Tianjin, he got to visit with Flo and the girls. He returns again to Scotland in 1939, but along the way, he left Flo in Canada to visit with her parents. In 1940, Florence and the girls joined Eric in Scotland. They spent 5 wonderful months there, and then they knew God's calling us to go back. And God was calling them to go back even with all of the turmoil that was happening, because now war is happening. World War II has begun. Crossing the Atlantic by ship was now very risky, and they would put columns of ships together as they were going across, and they were guarded by the Royal Navy, Great Britain's Navy. They were guarded on either side, but the Royal Navy would only go out 2 days' worth with the convoy because they thought that the German U-boats couldn't go farther. Well, they found out once the Royal Navy ships left that the U-boats could go very much farther. There were 2 ships that were sunk on either side of the ship that Eric Liddell and his family were on. That one time, in the middle of the night, they heard a huge thud. A torpedo actually hit their ship, but it didn't explode. So they knew by God's grace. They finally sounded the alarm and said, every ship for yourself, in order to get to Canada. They made it to Canada, but then they were hearing that while they were there, they got word that the Japanese had decided to occupy the area that Eric Liddell was working in. And it was too hard. So he decided, Flo, you need to stay in Canada till all of this settles down. He would write Flo every day. And the closer that the Japanese forces got to completing roads, because they just came in and occupied, the worse their behavior got. 5 months after Eric returned to the area, the Japanese then ordered all the foreigners to get out. So he leaves the countryside and went back to the city. He's back in Tianjin. And Eric, while he missed his girls, he missed Flo. He told them on their way out, he said, those who love God never meet for the last time. Something in Eric knew that this was a dangerous situation, that he didn't know if he would see his family again. During the uncertainty of life, Eric put in his work. He wanted to write a manual, so he began writing a manual of Christian discipleship. When he got news that his newest daughter was born, when Flo was left in Canada, she was pregnant, and they had a 3rd daughter that they named Maureen. After the Pearl Harbor attack in December of 1941, the Japanese troops in China were very hostile toward foreigners, and especially the British and the Americans, who were now officially the enemy. Electrified barricades were put up around the areas that they lived in, and Japanese soldiers were at watch all the time. Any gathering of over 10 people was banned. So Eric, who on his last time back in Scotland had become an ordained pastor, he would write a sermon for every Sunday, and he would invite 9 people over, because you couldn't have more than 10. So you had to have yourself and 9 others. And he would read the sermon to them. And he would give copies to the 9 people. And the 9 people would then go out. And they would invite another 9 people over for tea. And they would share the gospel, share the sermon and discuss it. And then everybody who got invited to those would go find another 9 people to meet with. And every Sunday they had afternoon tea church. That's how they got around doing church, until everyone had heard the sermon for that Sunday. Eric began thinking that his time in China was coming to an end. And the Japanese said that everybody could go home by the end of 1941, but that changed. They changed their minds. All British and American enemies were to report to an internment camp in the center of a province that was southwest from Tianjin, 400 miles away. They said no enemies would be allowed to leave China to return to their home country. Well, they walk into this internment camp. It's like somewhat a prison. And on the top, in Chinese, was written, "The courtyard of the happy way." Nobody was happy to be in that courtyard. They had packed things together to send ahead. Those didn't come for 3 weeks, so Eric had to sleep on the floor of his dorm for 3 weeks until the convoy of trucks arrived with his bed. But all the people learned to work together while they were there. Eric was in demand both as a teacher and as a member of the athletics department. Many of the missionaries in the camp were from the China Inland Mission, and he would interact with the kids, and he became one of the favorite people of the children, and they would all call him Uncle Eric. Eric also ran a Friday night youth group with square dancing, chess tournaments, puppet plays, quiz shows. There was one young lady who got sick with another woman, and they put her in the morgue. They put both of them in the morgue because they thought they were going to die. Eric went every day. The older lady ended up dying after a couple days, but every day, Eric, for 2 weeks, he would visit the young lady who was in the morgue sick until she got better, and she did get better at a risk of his own health. They were allowed to write in a form letter with a small grid of squares, and they had to put one word in each square, so he had to figure out what he wanted to tell Flo because it was the only thing he could say. Towards the end of 1944, something happened at a running contest. Eric was still running. He was still beating everybody. But something happened that made everybody wonder if something might be wrong with Eric. It was a crisp autumn day, and Eric entered a race. Whenever he ran, he always ran as fast as he could. But on this particular day, he lost the race to one of the schoolboys. Word started spreading around the camp that Eric had lost a race. Annie Buchan, who was the matron of the hospital in Souchong where Eric and Robert served, she knew something was going on because she noticed that Eric was not as strong as he had been and was looking very pale. He would lie down for hours on his bed with just a wet cloth over his eyes. January 1945, shortly after his 43rd birthday, he would go in and out of the hospital for several weeks. He had a small stroke, and after that fell into a coma. And then 9:30 on the evening of February 21st, 1945, Eric Little died. They didn't know what was going on. The doctor there did an autopsy and found that he had a brain tumor, and they had no idea. Eric Little's funeral service was held on Saturday the 24th, 3 days after he died, and a gentleman named A.P. Cullen led the service. A.P. taught, he was a little older than Eric, he taught at the Eltham School, the college in London, and he went ahead of Eric to the Anglo-Chinese school in Tianjin. So he probably knew Eric the most. He had spent the most time with him. 2 months after Eric's death, word finally came to Flo that her husband had died. The visitors explained that the doctors did the autopsy. They found the massive tumor on the left side of his brain, and she knew, being a nurse, she knew there was nothing for them to do to help him then. On August 17th, just 6 months after Eric had been buried, the internees, the prisoners at the internment camp, heard different sounding planes overhead. And when they looked, it was the American bombers who were coming to liberate them. There were 1,800 people in this small little camp. And all of them, every account that was written about their time there, all of them mentioned Uncle Eric. He touched everybody's lives who were there. He never considered himself anything special. He was just a man who tried to honor God and help people. In the end, achieving those two simple goals made him a very special person to countless people around the world. The mouse became the Flying Scotsman, but then was honored as Li Mushi. But everybody knew him as Uncle Eric. Everybody came in contact with him. There is now a middle school that stands on the site where the internment camp was. His grave wasn't found until 1989. And today there's a little picture of him that hangs there. The town that he was from in Scotland took stone from Scotland and made a memorial and set it up in by the school where the internment camp was. And there's a picture when it was dedicated in 1991. Those are his 3 daughters who dedicated the memorial to him. And later on, they added, back in the mid-90s, they added a statue of him running. But missionary stories and stories of people of the faith, they stir us. And I think in a huge way, they make Scripture come alive for us. And when I think of Eric Liddell, I think of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. Are you stirred? I'm stirred. Let's just live for Jesus. Amen.